250,000 years ago, a group of early humans stands at the edge of a forest in what is now northern Europe, and the temperature is dropping toward freezing, and none of them can make fire. Not won't. Not haven't gotten around to it yet. Can't. The technology to strike a spark on demand, to coax a flame out of nothing whenever it is needed, does not yet exist for these particular people, in this particular place, at this particular moment in time, and for decades, the working assumption among archaeologists was that this scenario was basically impossible. No fire meant no Europe. No fire meant no surviving a glacial winter. No fire for a hairless, clawless, slow-running primate meant death. That assumption turned out to be wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong by hundreds of thousands of years and by an entire continent's worth of missing campfires. Early hominins occupied the coldest parts of Europe for an extraordinarily long stretch of prehistory, with no reliable evidence that they were making fire at all. They were there. The bones and the stone tools prove they were there. The hearths, the ash, the charcoal that should be sitting next to those bones and tools if fire were part of daily life, for enormous stretches of time, at site after site, that evidence simply is not present. So the question this video is actually asking is not when did humans invent fire, because that question has a somewhat blurry but roughly known answer. Somewhere in a very long window stretching back well over 1 million years, depending on which claim a given researcher is willing to defend. The question is stranger and more specific than that. What did people do in the gap? What happens to a body, a diet, a social group, a single freezing night when the one tool modern humans treat as absolutely non-negotiable for surviving cold simply isn't available? Not as a hypothetical, not as a survival show stunt with a rescue team on standby, but as the actual ordinary condition of an entire population's entire life. This isn't a fringe question restricted to a handful of specialists arguing at conferences nobody outside the field attends. It sits at the center of one of the more contentious live debates in Paleolithic archaeology, one with real researchers on real opposing sides of real published disagreements, still being argued out in journals as recently as this year. Every chapter that follows is going to sit inside that gap. The space between humans needed fire to survive here, and the evidence says they very often didn't have it, and trace, piece by piece, argument by argument, what filled the space instead. The place to start is southwest France, in the Dordogne region, at a limestone rock shelter called Combe-Grenal. Between the 1950s and the 1960s, French archaeologist François Bordes excavated this site down through more than 60 distinct occupation layers, spanning roughly 200,000 years of intermittent Neanderthal habitation. Decades later, that same sequence became the centerpiece of a very different kind of study, one that wasn't asking what tools Neanderthals made, but when they were using fire at all. Archaeologist Denis Sandgathe, working with colleagues including Harold Dibble, went back through the Combe-Grenal layers and the nearby site of Pech de Laz V, specifically looking for signs of fire, burned bone, charcoal, reddened and heat-altered sediment, the kind of residue a hearth leaves behind even after tens of thousands of years. What the team found was a pattern that should not have existed if fire was, as most textbooks assumed, a basic and constant part of Neanderthal life. Fire evidence was abundant in the warmer occupation layers, and in the colder layers, the ones representing the harshest glacial conditions, exactly the periods when a modern person would assume fire mattered most, the evidence declined sharply, in some layers disappearing almost entirely. Here's the part worth sitting with for a second. This is backwards from what anyone would predict. If Neanderthals could make fire whenever they wanted, need should track with cold, more fire in the freezing layers, not less. Instead, fire tracks with warmth. That single inverted correlation, repeated across multiple sites, is the data point the entire modern fire debate is built on. So what does that inversion actually mean? There are two live competing explanations for it in the literature, and neither one is a straw man. Both are argued by working archaeologists in peer-reviewed journals right now, which is itself unusual for a documentary-style video to admit out loud, but it's the honest state of the field. The first explanation, championed by Sandgathe and Dibble, is the simplest read of the data. Neanderthals in this specific region, at these specific sites, could not manufacture fire on demand. They were obligate fire users in only a limited sense, dependent on capturing and maintaining fire from natural sources, primarily lightning-strike wildfires. And lightning-caused wildfires are measurably rarer in cold, dry glacial conditions than in warm, humid ones. Fewer natural fires available to capture in winter would produce exactly the pattern seen in the ground: fire in warm layers, silence in cold ones. The second explanation comes from archaeologist Andrew Sorensen, and it complicates the picture rather than simply contradicting it. Sorensen's argument, published in 2017, is that the drop-off in cold weather lightning strikes isn't actually steep enough to explain a near-total disappearance of fire evidence. There would still have been modest wildfire activity even in cold periods, according to his modeling, meaning Neanderthals should have still had some access to natural fire if they wanted it. So if it isn't pure unavailability, what is it? Sorensen's answer draws on later microwear analysis of stone tools. More on that in the next chapter, which he argues shows some Neanderthal groups absolutely could strike sparks from flint and pyrite on purpose. His explanation for the cold layer drop-off isn't they couldn't, but they didn't need to as often. Smaller, more task-specific fires in harsher conditions, leaving a thinner archaeological signature that looks like absence without actually being absence. And there's a third position in this same debate worth naming, because it's the one that turns the whole argument into something almost unsettling. In 2023, Sandgathe and colleagues published a modeling paper, nicknamed Embers, testing a different mechanism entirely. Not they never had the skill, and not they just used less fire, but cultural loss. The model treats fire-starting knowledge the way cognitive scientists treat a perishable skill like CPR, something that decays if it isn't practiced. Under this model, a Neanderthal group that stopped needing to make fire from scratch for long enough, because natural fire was locally abundant for a while, could plausibly lose the technique altogether, the way any unused skill fades out of a small population over a few generations. Then, when conditions turned colder and drier and natural fire became scarce, that group wouldn't just be using fire less, they would have already forgotten how to start it themselves, at the exact moment they needed it most. Sit with that for a second. Not primitive people who never figured out fire. Populations that may have figured it out, lost it, needed it back, and couldn't recover it in time. That's not a story about a missing invention. That's a story about a fragile one. It's worth being precise about what losing fire would have actually meant day to day, because it isn't the same as simply being cold. A hearth in a Paleolithic rock shelter wasn't only heat. It was light in a season when daylight in glacial Europe might run 6 or 7 hours. It was a defense against nocturnal predators drawn to a sleeping group of primates. It was, per evidence covered in Chapter 3, a mechanism for eventually accessing calories locked inside foods that were difficult or dangerous to eat raw. Losing fire access, even temporarily, wasn't losing one convenience. It was losing several unrelated survival functions at once, on exactly the nights those functions mattered most. If some Neanderthal groups really could produce fire on demand, what would the physical evidence for that even look like? Ash doesn't last hundreds of thousands of years in a form that proves intention rather than accident. So in 2018, Andrew Sorensen, alongside colleagues Marie Seresi and Cyril Claude, working out of Leiden University in the Netherlands, tried a different kind of evidence entirely. Not the residue of fire itself, but the wear pattern left on the tool that might have made it. The team examined dozens of hand-sized bifacial stone tools recovered from multiple Middle Paleolithic sites across France, looking specifically for a very distinctive kind of microscopic damage under high magnification, small, rounded, polished striking zones concentrated on one edge, consistent with the tool being struck repeatedly, at a specific angle, against a mineral surface. They then ran controlled experiments, replicating the strike a light process by hand, using flint bifaces against nodules of pyrite, a mineral that throws hot sparks when struck correctly, the same basic mechanism later used in flintlock firearms, and compared the wear their own experimental strikes produced against the wear on the ancient tools. The match was specific enough to publish. The damage on a subset of the ancient bifaces was consistent in Sorensen's analysis, not with butchery, not with woodworking, not with any of the dozen other things a stone tool gets used for, but specifically with the repeated percussive motion of deliberate fire starting. The dating placed some of this evidence in the range of roughly 50,000 years ago during the late Mysterian period in France, meaning, if the interpretation holds, Neanderthals were not just harvesting wildfire. At least some groups, at least some of the time, were manufacturing their own ignition, on purpose, using a repeatable technique. But, and this is the pattern interrupt worth pausing on, proving a technique existed somewhere is not the same as proving it existed everywhere, or that everyone had it, or that it never got lost. That's precisely why the Sandgathe versus Sorensen disagreement in Chapter 1 isn't actually settled by this discovery. It's possible for both things to be true at once. Some Neanderthal populations, in some regions, at some periods, had a working strike-a-light method. Other populations, elsewhere, or the same population at a different point in time, might not have, either because the technique never spread to them, or because, per the 2023 cultural loss model, they'd once had it and lost it. Will Robrooks, a Leiden archaeologist and one of the most prominent researchers in this exact debate, put the broader uncertainty plainly when a separate and even older possible fire-making claim came up for review in late 2025. A set of flint and pyrite fragments from the site of Barnham in England, argued by some researchers to represent evidence of fire starting far earlier than the Mousterian tools Sorensen examined. Robrooks, reviewing that claim without having been part of the study, said the team had done careful analytical work, but that he wasn't yet convinced the evidence showed deliberate fire-making rather than something that merely resembled it. Dennis Sandgathe, the same researcher from Chapter 1, on the other side of the broader fire debate, said in response to the same claim that he'd like to see it investigated further before treating it as confirmed. That's worth noticing, because it's rare for a documentary to show this part, two of the most prominent fire researchers on record disagreeing across nearly a decade of publications, still not fully agreeing with each other in the same week a new claim comes out. Nobody in this field is bluffing certainty. What follows from here, the actual survival strategies used in the gaps where fire wasn't reliably available, is what the evidence shows regardless of which side of the ignition debate turns out to be correct, because both sides agree on the core fact. For very long stretches in very cold places, plenty of early humans were living through nights and winters with no fire at hand at all. Before asking how ancient humans stayed warm without fire, there's a more basic question, and it comes from an unexpected source: dental plaque. In 2007, the Atapuerca research team, excavating the Sima del Elefante site in northern Spain, recovered hominin dental remains dated to roughly 2 million years ago, among the oldest hominin fossils found in Western Europe. Nearly a decade later, a team led by researchers at the University of York analyzed calcified dental plaque preserved on those teeth, extracting microscopic residues that had survived over 1 million years lodged in fossilized tartar, fragments of raw animal tissue, uncooked starch granules from grasses, pine pollen, insect fragments, even what may be a fragment of an early toothpick. What the plaque did not contain was microcharcoal, the telltale particulate signature of proximity to fire, the same kind of residue that shows up reliably in the plaque of populations known to be cooking regularly. The conclusion the York team drew was direct. This individual was eating a diet that included raw meat and raw plant material with no detectable evidence of cooking more than 1 million years ago in a location humans had already reached. That's not a footnote. That's a population successfully feeding itself, digesting its food, and apparently thriving enough to leave descendants, without the metabolic shortcut cooking provides. This connects directly to something Will Robrooks and his colleague Paula Villa argued in their landmark 2011 review, published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences, the same paper that, alongside Sandgathe's site-level work, anchors most of the modern fire in Europe debate. Robrooks and Villa built a database of 141 European sites with possible fire evidence, spanning from about 1-2 million years ago down to 35,000 years ago, and concluded that early hominins moved into and occupied the cold northern latitudes of Europe without habitual fire use, for what may have been hundreds of thousands of years before fire became a consistent, regular part of the technological toolkit somewhere in the range of 300 to 400,000 years ago. Here's the pattern interrupt. Doesn't that timeline sound backwards? The assumption baked into almost every popular account of human evolution is fire let humans leave Africa and survive the cold. Robrooks and Villa's argument flips that causal order. Cold climate colonization came first, for a remarkably long stretch without habitual fire. Fire, at least as a constant daily tool, came later, arguably as an intensification of survival capability that was already somehow working without it. There's a nutritional cost buried in that raw diet, and it's worth naming rather than skipping past. Cooking does real, measurable metabolic work. It breaks down tough plant fiber and denatures proteins, which means a cooked meal delivers more usable calories per bite than the identical meal eaten raw, for less chewing and less digestive effort. A population eating raw meat and raw starches in cold climate Europe, as the Sima del Elefante plaque evidence suggests, was almost certainly extracting less net energy from the same food than a population with regular access to fire at precisely the season when caloric demand for maintaining body heat runs highest. That's not a minor footnote. It means whatever else was compensating for the missing fire had to compensate doubly for the lost external heat source, and for a diet that delivered less net energy to begin with. The fact that populations still persisted under that double burden for as long as the site record suggests they did is arguably the single most surprising fact in the entire debate. So if raw food and cold were both survivable without fire, what was actually doing the survival work? That's where the next two chapters go. First, the body itself, and then the tools built to substitute for a hearth. Jump forward, geographically and in time, to the far southern tip of South America, the archipelago called Tierra del Fuego, Land of Fire, a name given by European sailors, including Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, who spotted the glow of bonfires dotting the coastline from offshore. The name itself is a clue about what's coming, because the people who lit those fires were doing something that struck nearly every European observer who encountered them as close to impossible. The Yagan people, also recorded as Umana, lived along the channels and islands of Tierra del Fuego for roughly 7,000 years in a climate that regularly drops toward negative 20 degrees Celsius, is almost constantly wet, and is scoured by some of the fiercest sustained winds on the planet, and by nearly every European account. Including Charles Darwin's own field notes from his voyage on the Beagle, the Yagan often wore startlingly little clothing while doing it, sometimes nothing at all, even in near-freezing rain. Darwin's response, recorded in his journals, was genuine bewilderment. He could not reconcile what he was seeing with what he assumed the human body required to survive. Modern research has given his confusion a physiological answer he didn't have access to. In 1960, physiologist H.T. Hamel led a study measuring the basal metabolic rate of 9 Fuegian individuals from the Alakaluf group under cold exposure, and found their resting metabolic rate ran at roughly 160% of the rate measured in an average cold exposed European. Their bodies, at rest, were quite simply generating more internal heat than a typical European body would under the same conditions, without shivering, without extra clothing, and, crucially for this video, often without a fire actively burning at that exact moment either. A more recent study, published in Scientific Reports in 2021 by a research team led by Mikiko Watanabe and Lucio Ganesi, examined the skeletal remains of 12 adult Fuegian individuals collected in the 19th century, analyzing bone density alongside genetic markers tied to a tissue called brown adipose tissue, or BAT, a specialized kind of fat that, unlike ordinary white fat, actively burns energy to generate heat rather than simply storing it. The study identified elevated frequency of a specific genetic variant linked to brown fat development in the Fuegian population, and found their bone density remained comparable to populations living in far milder climates. Evidence, the researchers argued, that brown fat-driven internal heat generation may have been protecting not just comfort but skeletal health across a lifetime of cold exposure. None of that means fire was optional for the Yagan. It clearly wasn't. Darwin himself watched them tend fires constantly, in their shelters and even inside their canoes, and the archipelago is named for exactly that behavior. What it means is something more specific and, honestly, stranger: the gap between has fire and doesn't have fire, right now. In this specific hour was smaller for a body like this than it would be for an unadapted modern person, because part of the heat-generating job that a fire does was already being handled internally, continuously, without anyone tending it. There's an important distinction buried in that Hamel measurement worth spelling out, because it's easy to misread. A basal metabolic rate running at 160% of a cold, exposed European baseline doesn't mean the Yagans simply felt the cold less. It means their bodies were spending measurably more caloric energy around the clock, specifically to generate warmth, which means the adaptation itself came at a cost paid in food. A higher idle metabolism has to be fed. That single fact reframes the entire strategy Anthropology, this wasn't a free biological workaround. It was a trade, calories for warmth, running continuously, funded by one of the richest and most reliable marine food sources available anywhere on the planet, the shellfish beds, fish stocks, and marine mammal populations of the Beagle Channel and the surrounding coves the Yaghan occupied for millennia. Take away that food base, and the same metabolic strategy that kept a Yaghan body warm without heavy clothing would very quickly become a liability instead of an advantage. The body wasn't beating physics. It was outsourcing part of the heating bill to an unusually generous local pantry. The Yaghan supplemented that internal furnace further by coating their skin in thick layers of seal and fish grease, an external insulating barrier against wind and wet that multiple ethnographic accounts describe as more effective, in practice, against the specific combination of cold wind and constant rain in that environment. Then the animal hide garments worn by neighboring inland groups like the Selknam, whose drier, colder, but less perpetually soaked territory made hide clothing the more practical option instead. So here's the pattern interrupt worth asking directly. Was fire the thing keeping these populations alive? Or was fire one tool among several, some external, some internal? Some literally written into the genome, all working together, none of them sufficient alone? The archaeological and physiological record increasingly points to the second answer, and that reframes everything still to come. The Yaghan case shows a population with visible, measurable internal heat generation compensating for minimal external insulation. But there's an older, thornier version of the same question that anthropologists have been fighting about since the early 20th century. Was the Neanderthal body itself, independent of any culture or technology, already shaped by evolution specifically to survive cold without fire? The classic version of this argument goes back to physical anthropologist Erich Trinkaus, whose analysis of Neanderthal skeletal proportions, published across multiple papers beginning in 1981, found a strikingly consistent pattern: a wide, barrel-shaped trunk, a broad pelvis, and, critically, shortened forearm and lower leg segments relative to the upper arm and thigh. That specific proportion isn't random. It matches a well-established biological principle called Allen's rule, which holds that cold-adapted endothermic animals tend to evolve shorter limb extremities, because a shorter limb has less surface area exposed to the air relative to its volume, which means less heat radiated away from the body's core. Arctic foxes have shorter legs and ears than desert foxes for exactly this reason. Trinkaus's data suggested Neanderthals fit the same pattern, a body plan seemingly built to conserve heat by minimizing exposed surface area, the biological equivalent of the bear pelt strategy from Chapter 4, except worn permanently in the bones themselves rather than draped over the skin. For decades, that was close to consensus. Then it started coming apart. And the way it came apart matters, because it's a genuine elimination reveal, not a simple confirmation. The first challenge came from the face. If Neanderthals were built for cold, their nasal structure should show it, and the traditional prediction, following the same heat conservation logic as the limbs, was that Neanderthals should have narrow nasal passages, since a narrower nose warms and humidifies incoming air more efficiently before it reaches the lungs, reducing heat loss on inhalation. But when researchers actually measured Neanderthal nasal cavities against that prediction, they found close to the opposite: wide nasal openings and a projecting, forward-jutting midface, a shape that on paper looks like poor cold engineering. Not good cold engineering. A 2011 analysis explicitly titled "The Neanderthal Face" is not cold adapted argued exactly this. The facial evidence contradicted the postcranial evidence, and researchers couldn't have it both ways. Either the body proportion argument was wrong, or the nose meant something other than thermoregulation, or the whole cold adaptation framework needed rethinking. For over a decade, that contradiction sat mostly unresolved, genuinely, publicly unresolved, the kind of gap serious researchers admit exists rather than paper over. Then newer work using computational fluid dynamics, essentially running airflow simulations through detailed, three-dimensional scans of Neanderthal nasal cavities rather than relying on external measurements alone, began to suggest the internal architecture was doing something the external shape had obscured. A wide external nose, it turns out, doesn't automatically mean poor internal air conditioning if the internal cavity geometry is warming and humidifying the air efficiently anyway. A comprehensive 2025 review pulling together the fossil, physiological, And archaeological evidence reframed the entire debate, rather than any single trait, limbs, trunk, or nose, being the one definitive signature of Neanderthal cold adaptation. The review argued for what it called an integrated response, where body proportions, nasal airflow engineering, elevated basal metabolism, energy-dense diet, and quite possibly brown fat activity, similar to what's documented in the Fuegian population, were all operating together, each handling part of the thermal load rather than any one feature carrying it alone. Here's the pattern interrupt worth sitting with. Notice that this argument took over 40 years, several outright reversals, and still isn't fully closed. The 2025 review is explicit that physiological adaptations remain inferential, not proven. That's not a flaw in the science. That's what real science on extinct populations actually looks like. Propose a mechanism, find contradicting evidence, hold the contradiction publicly, and only slowly build toward a picture that accounts for all of it rather than picking the tidiest story and defending it. The Neanderthal body wasn't simply cold adapted in some vague storybook sense. It was apparently cold adapted through several separate, only partially understood biological channels running in parallel, which is, not coincidentally, exactly the same pattern this entire video keeps finding at every scale, from continents down to individual skeletons. Every chapter so far has drawn from European and South American evidence. Now cross to China, to a limestone cave system near Beijing called Zhoukoudian, the site that produced the famous Peking man fossils, roughly 40 partial skeletons of Homo erectus, excavated between 1921 and 1966, with occupation layers dated from over 700,000 years ago down to around 230,000 years ago. For most of the 20th century, Zhoukoudian was cited in essentially every textbook as proof that Homo erectus used fire. Early excavators reported thick layers of ash, charred animal bone, and blackened stone in the cave. And the story became a kind of foundational myth for the whole field, humanity's ancient cousins, warming themselves by hearths in a Chinese cave 750,000 years ago. Then, in 1998, a team led by Steve Weiner of the Weizmann Institute of Science went back and re-examined that ash using modern microstratigraphic and mineralogical techniques that simply hadn't existed when the original excavations happened decades earlier. Published in the journal Science, their findings were blunt. The material long identified as ash showed no chemical or structural signature consistent with burning at all. Much of it, the team argued, was water-laid sediment, mineral deposits left behind by seasonal flooding or dripping groundwater, not fire residue. Some of the supposedly burned bone and stone, they suggested, might reflect natural processes entirely unrelated to hominin activity. In a single paper, one of the most iconic proof of ancient fire sites in the world had its central evidence pulled out from under it. For close to 2 decades after that, the standard position shifted hard the other way. Zhoukoudian went from textbook certain fire evidence to a cautionary tale about how easily natural sediment can be mistaken for a hearth. But the story didn't stay settled there either. Researcher Fuegian and colleagues went back to the same layers with yet another round of analytical techniques, this time examining the material for elemental potassium and specific compounds called silicious aggregates, chemical signatures that modern combustion research has linked specifically to the burning of organic plant material, distinct from what water deposition alone would produce. Published in Current Anthropology in 2017. Their reanalysis reported finding exactly those combustion-linked chemical signatures concentrated in specific layers, arguing this constituted renewed supporting evidence for in situ, human-controlled fire use at the site after all, directly contesting Weiner's 1998 conclusion using newer chemistry than either team originally had access to. As of now, this specific site remains an active, unresolved argument between specialists using increasingly sophisticated tools to examine the exact same handful of ancient cave layers 3 separate times, 60 years apart, and reaching 3 different headline conclusions. That's the pattern interrupt this chapter earns. Notice how the story of Zhoukoudian is not ancient humans had fire. And it's not ancient humans definitely didn't. It's a live demonstration of how fragile and technique-dependent fire evidence actually is across the entire discipline, which makes every confident-sounding claim in the earlier chapters of this video worth holding with exactly the same care. The ground itself keeps changing its story as the tools for reading it improve. If the body could be quietly modified by evolution to need less external heat, the next logical substitute is external insulation that doesn't require a flame to produce or maintain fur, fat, and shelter. At the site of Schningen in Germany, already one of the most important Paleolithic sites in the world, for producing a set of extraordinarily well-preserved wooden hunting spears. Researchers examining animal bone assemblages found something else: cut marks on bear bones, specifically positioned in patterns consistent not with meat removal, but with the careful, deliberate skinning of an animal to preserve its pelt intact. The site dates to marine isotope stage 9, roughly 300,000 years ago. Squarely inside the period Robrooks and Villa's database marks as still largely fire scarce across much of northern Europe. Researchers from the University of Tübingen, analyzing this material, argued the pattern suggests hominins at Schningen were deliberately harvesting bear hides, not for food, since the cut pattern doesn't match butchery for meat, but specifically for the pelt itself, presumably to be worn or used as insulation against the cold of a northwestern European winter. That detail matters more than it might first appear. A bear coat is not a passive object. Bear fur is exceptionally dense, layered, and water-resistant, arguably better winter insulation, pound for pound, than most other locally available hides. Choosing to specifically hunt and skin the single best insulated animal in the local ecosystem at a site that predates habitual fire use by tens of thousands of years is not an accident. It's a substitution. Where a fire radiates external heat outward into a space, a well-made hide traps a person's own body heat close against the skin, forming a kind of wearable, mobile version of the exact same function. This lines up with a broader argument some paleoanthropologists have made about the earliest human migrations into cold climate Europe more generally, that clothing, shelter construction, and body fat-based physiological adaptation may have functioned as parallel, overlapping technologies alongside fire, rather than fire being the single load-bearing pillar everything else depended on. Remove any one piece: a body that runs a slightly hotter idle metabolism, a hide that traps heat close to skin, a low windbreak shelter that cuts wind chill by simple physics, and the others still do real, measurable work. None of this means the cold nights were comfortable. They almost certainly weren't. But uncomfortable and survivable is a very different outcome than impossible, and it's the second one that the old assumption insisted on, and the second one the evidence keeps failing to support. There's a third leg to this stool beyond bodies and hides, and it's the most literal one: shelter engineered specifically to make whatever heat was available go further. At the site of Mezhyrich, in central Ukraine, about 70 miles southeast of Kiev, a farmer digging to expand his basement in 1965 struck what turned out to be a mammoth jawbone, and kept digging into what became one of the most striking discoveries in Ice Age archaeology: 4 separate circular dwellings, each built from roughly 100 to 150 individual mammoth bones and tusks, arranged deliberately into load-bearing domed structures between roughly 6 and 10 meters across. Excavation teams working the site through the late 1960s and 1970s documented skulls and long bones stacked and interlocked to form solid walls, with tusks and the largest flat bones placed across the top specifically to weigh down and stabilize what was likely a covering of animal hide or birch bark stretched over a wooden frame beneath, a layered structure engineered, piece by piece, to block wind. A revised radiocarbon chronology published in 2025 by archaeologist Wei Chu of Leiden University and colleagues placed the structures firmly within the coldest, most resource-scarce phase of the last glacial maximum, meaning these shelters weren't built during a comfortable interlude between hard winters. They were built specifically to get a small group of people, likely somewhere between 5 and 7 individuals per structure according to the research team, through the single harshest climatic stretch late Ice Age Europe had to offer. Chu's team also found something that complicates any simple they built houses so they didn't need fire reading. The reanalysis suggests occupation at the site may have been surprisingly brief per visit, possibly a single season, rather than a long-term year-round settlement, meaning the mammoth-bone architecture may have functioned less like a permanent home and more like a purpose-built emergency shelter, assembled and reassembled at specific, predictable moments of maximum climatic stress. Worth being precise here, because overstating this chapter would undercut its own credibility, excavators did find hearth remains near the center of these dwellings, so this is not a story about total fire absence. It's a story about amplification. A domed wall built from 100+ interlocking mammoth bones, weighted with tusks and wrapped in hide, does something a fire alone cannot do. It stops wind, traps a pocket of warmed air close to the ground, and turns whatever heat a small fire produces into something that actually stays where the people using it need it to stay, instead of scattering into open tundra air. The architecture and the fire weren't competing solutions. They were multiplying each other's effectiveness, which is arguably the same relationship every strategy in this video has to every other one. None of them, alone, closes the gap completely. Together, layered, redundantly, they get a small group of Ice Age humans through the coldest weeks of the coldest millennia the species has faced. This is the part of the story that changes the tone, because everything up to now has been building toward competence, bodies, tools, hides, techniques, all quietly compensating for a missing fire. The turn is what happens when compensation isn't enough, and the honest record shows that it sometimes wasn't. Go back to the 2023 Embers modeling paper, the cultural skill decay hypothesis from Chapter 1. The uncomfortable implication buried inside that model is not just fire-starting knowledge could be lost. It's that a population could lose it at precisely the worst possible moment, during exactly the kind of prolonged, worsening, cold and dry glacial stretch when both the skill and the natural fire sources it might have compensated for were disappearing at the same time. Not a single bad week, a slow-motion, generational bottleneck, where each successive cold spell made recovery of the skill less likely, not more, because the conditions needed to relearn or reinvent fire starting from scratch, abundant dry tinder, functional demonstration, enough surplus time and safety to experiment, are exactly the conditions a harsh glacial landscape withholds. And this dovetails with something that's easy to miss in the site-by-site data from Chapter 1. The fire evidence at Combe-Grenal and Pech de Laz IV doesn't just decline during cold periods. At some sites, across some stretches, it appears to nearly vanish. Sandgathe and Dibble's own interpretation of that gap is not neutral or comfortable. If a Neanderthal group truly had no reliable way to produce fire, and if a stretch of colder, drier weather also meant fewer wildfires to scavenge from, then some of those groups may have gone through extended periods, weeks, possibly longer, with no fire available to them at all, in conditions cold enough that fire for a modern population would be considered essential rather than optional. There is no surviving testimony from a Neanderthal describing what that was actually like. That silence is itself the point. Everything reconstructed in this video, the bare pelts, the brown fat, the raw diet, the strike-a-light microwear, is inference built from bone and stone and residue, never from a first-person account of the fear or the cold or the loss. The physiological and technological workarounds were real, and they clearly worked often enough to keep populations alive across hundreds of thousands of years. But often enough is not the same as always, and the population-level cost of the gaps, the winters when the workarounds weren't quite enough, left no direct record at all. It's visible only indirectly, in the fact that fire use eventually did become non-negotiable and universal, as though something in the deep cultural memory of the species had permanently concluded that going without it again was a risk not worth repeating. By roughly 300 to 400,000 years ago, per Robrock's and Villa's review, fire evidence across the European sites in their database stops being sporadic and starts being consistent, present at site after site, occupation after occupation, in a way that reads less like a discovery still spreading and more like a threshold quietly, permanently crossed. Later confirmation work, including newer excavations in Spain reported in the mid-2020s, pushing possible controlled fire use back toward roughly 250,000 years ago at some sites, keeps nudging that threshold slightly earlier, but the shape of the pattern hasn't changed. Sporadic and inconsistent for an extraordinarily long time, then, at some point, simply always there. It's worth asking what actually flips a technology from one option among several to permanently mandatory. Because that shift is rarely about the technology getting better in isolation, it's usually about everything built downstream of it changing so completely that going back stops being a real option. Once cooking became routine. Digestive systems and jaw structures across the hominin lineage appear to have gradually shifted towards smaller teeth and guts adapted to processed food, a change that would have made a full return to a raw, uncooked diet progressively harder on the body with each successive generation. Once social groups began organizing nightly activity around a central hearth, the light, the shared warmth. The exact kind of gathering point that later shows up associated with early symbolic behavior and group cohesion at Upper Paleolithic sites, losing that gathering point wasn't just losing heat, it was losing a piece of social infrastructure. In other words, the very long period this video has spent exploring, where fire was present, absent, lost, reinvented, and argued over by researchers 100,000 years later, wasn't a stable equilibrium so much as a ratchet. Every advantage fire provided made the eventual, permanent version of fire dependency a little more locked in, a little harder to walk back from, until at some point walking back from it stopped being survivable at all. That's the part worth carrying out of this video. Fire didn't arrive and immediately become mandatory. It arrived, disappeared, reappeared, may have been lost entirely by some groups and rebuilt by others, existed as one tool among several competing and complementary survival technologies for a genuinely staggering span of time. And only very late in that story did it stop being optional. Modern humans inherited the endpoint of that long, uneven process. A species for whom fire now feels like the single, non-negotiable foundation of survival in the cold, so obvious it barely registers as a technology at all. The archaeological record underneath that feeling tells a much messier, much more contingent story. One where bodies adapted along several separate and only partially understood biological channels, hides were chosen deliberately for their specific insulating properties, ignition techniques were invented and quite possibly lost and reinvented more than once, and an enormous amount of cold, wet, dark time was simply endured, using whatever combination of the above happened to be available, by people who had no guarantee any of it would be enough. And if the site record at Combe-Grenal and Pech is read the way Sandgathe and Dibble read it, sometimes found out that it barely was. None of this is settled science delivered from a place of certainty. Sorensen and Sandgathe still disagree. Weiner's 1998 reversal and Chen's 2017 counter-reversal at Zhoukoudian show how quickly a known fact can flip when the analytical tools improve. The 2025 review of Neanderthal cold adaptation explicitly calls its physiological claims inferential rather than proven. That unresolved quality isn't a weakness in the story, it's the most accurate possible ending for it. The people this video has been describing didn't have a settled answer either. They had bodies that mostly worked, techniques that sometimes held and sometimes failed, hides that kept out the wind more often than not, and a very long, very cold, very dark stretch of time to get through using all of it at once, with no guarantee on any given night that it would be enough.